Okay, so Eric Kornacki, welcome to the Local Food Summit, and thank you for joining us today.
It's my honor. Thank you for the invitation.
So, tell us where you're located today. Where are you speaking from?
Currently, I'm at my house. It's located in the Barnum neighborhood in Southwest Denver, which borders the Westwood neighborhood,
Mm-hmm.
where Revision has taken root over the past 9 years, and where we're currently involved in starting the Westwood Food Cooperative.
Yes. So, before we talk about the cooperative, I'd like you to tell us a little bit of the story of how you got into this. What led you to start working in the community of Westwood?
Great question. And I guess first and foremost, when we started Revision, we really were trying to think about what's the greatest change that we can bring to society, and how do we really kind of confront the norms and the structures of the economy as it has been built over the past 60 years. And we're particularly concerned about the sort of industrialization and the globalization of our food supply.
Yes.
On one hand, and on the other hand, we have this other problem of healthy food not being accessible and affordable for 24 million Americans in this country. And you don't have to go very far within your own city to find pockets where people are just living, as we now call them, in food deserts. And so when Revision got started, we both wanted to change the food system, but we also wanted to think about how to bring good food and fair food together in a way that honored people and did not come in to communities that don't have access to healthy food and put the blame on people. So we wanted to acknowledge that the circumstance where a lot of people find themselves is not their own fault. Part of this greater structural design, whether it's a consequence of that or whether it's intentional, most people in those situations can't do much about it. Right?
Yes, right.
So
before you go much farther, I want to back up and ask you about who you mean by we.
Right, great question. So typically, I think that in society, there's such an emphasis on blaming people that find themselves in poverty.
Yeah.
And so much of the dominant narrative is around, well, it's their fault for making bad choices.
Yeah. Yeah.
They just need to know, they need more education, or they need more incentive, or they need better character. And so I guess the we here is, I now consider myself part of this community, having lived here and worked here for the past 9 years. And the we are those of us on the ground trying to fight and try to change something.
But it was originally you and Joseph Typo, right?
Correct.
That started Revision. And what caused you to choose the community of Westwood to begin your work with Revision?
In a way, I think Westwood kind of chose us. And we had sort of done a scan of different food deserts within Denver. Westwood was really kind of at the bottom of our list initially. And that's because we didn't know much about it. We had been looking at traditionally some of the underserved communities around downtown and Northeast Park Hill, Globe Village, Swansea, Five Points, Curtis Park, although those neighborhoods are very different now than they were 10 years ago.
Yeah.
But somebody heard me talking at a community forum on food justice and said, you really need to come out and meet people in Westwood. It's a community that is hungry for change and has a lot of amazing people that are committed to doing the hard work. And so one afternoon, went out, met several residents that live in the neighborhood, listened to their story, and immediately was convinced that that was the place that we needed to do our work.
So you were really invited into the community.
Yeah, and it was just by simply having conversations and asking people what they wanted for their family, what they wanted for their future, listening to their history and where they came from, how they ended up in Westwood, and then trying to identify what their passions and skills were. And what we found is that, what Westwood has some of the worst health disparities in all of Denver, But just below that, I think it has some of the hardest working and most dedicated people that I've ever met. And so it was just a matter of, well, how do we really inspire and invest and get this community to just start planting seeds, literally planting seeds, cultivating earth, and seeing where we could take that as a community.
So could you describe for us what you found in the community? What was Westwood like when you got started? Yeah. Give us a picture.
Yeah. It's a beautiful community. I mean, it's I think if you spend half a day or a day there meeting people, you realize that there's just something, there's a spark, there's a passion that people have that I hadn't experienced in other communities in Denver. So it really is the epicenter of Denver's Latino community, about 84 or 85% Latino. Majority are immigrants from Mexico, some from Central America, but mainly Mexico. And so there is this beautiful connection that people from Mexico have to agriculture. And so a lot of the first stories that I heard when asking people, where they came from and what their connection to food was, people started telling me, you could just see their eyes light up and, oh, well, I grew up on a ranch and we had cattle and we had goats and we had sheep and chickens and we had a garden and we fed ourselves from it. Or I grew up riding horses. And so the connection to agriculture and the connection to the land was very palpable. It was something that you don't find very common in America, particularly not in urban cities.
That's true.
And then I asked the next question that came to mind was, well, why aren't you growing food here? Why this disconnect? What happened?
Yeah.
And most people said, well, I'm, living in an apartment or I'm renting a house and I don't know if I'm allowed to and maybe afraid to ask. I don't want to rock the boat. Or, where am I supposed to grow the food? I mean, I barely have a yard and this is Colorado and the weather and climate.
Very different from what they grew up in. Yeah,
exactly. So, those are all things that we were able to say we can help to overcome those barriers.
So how did you begin? How did you get started there?
Oh gosh. I mean, we had only a couple $1,000s to our name and had this idea that we could start a community food system led by its people that work for its people by teaching families to cultivate their own yards. And Westwood used to be farmland up until the 1940s. Grew a lot of cabbage out here.
Cabbage, interesting.
Farms, truck farming,
Yeah.
P.T. Barnum, the circus, founder. So Barnum neighborhood where I'm at is actually, he overwintered his animals here. So we've got a lot of good elephant dung in the soil. Right? Those are assets that we just need to activate.
So the soil was actually pretty clean.
Very clean. Yeah. There's no heavy industry out here. There's no history of environmental contamination on a macro scale. So that's a huge asset, which a lot of underserved communities generally don't find themselves in that position. So we felt that a household farming model would work. Started the first year, recruited 7 families that wanted to garden, and our commitment to them was we would provide all of the resources, seeds, plants, compost, tools. We'd help rototill, and then put in a drip irrigation system on a timer to save water. We would provide all of that up front if they made the commitment that they had to work in their garden every week and they had to share some of their produce with a neighbor, and they needed to try to recruit other people into the program.
So 7 people in the first year, 7 families.
7 families,
yeah.
I went to their house every week and started building a relationship as, I would teach them about the garden throughout the growing season and get to know them a little more.
So this is primarily you going out into the community.
At first, which was, I needed to kind of build that trust and rapport.
Sure.
I knew pretty quickly that it couldn't be me for very long, right? I needed to, I guess in order to truly earn the trust of the neighborhood, it couldn't be me. It needed to be people from the neighborhood.
Right.
We got to build that capacity and that ownership for this community to solve its problems itself therefore we needed to begin hiring and training people. And so the second year is when I hired 3 women from the neighborhood and then trained them as sort of a community health worker called a promotora, and gave them a job teaching other families how to garden and eat healthy.
So how many families by the end of the second year did you have?
Ooh, I think that second year we were 38, and then like 87 by year 3. And then at that point, we almost were doubling or tripling every year in terms of demand, and we had to start slowing it down. So at peak in 2014, I think we had 400 families participating.
Yeah, and today?
Today we've actually pulled back a little bit, so we're at 300.
Pulled back? Why did you pull back?
400 was not sustainable in terms of our capacity. It was just
I see.
Sheer insanity. Yeah.
Was that hard to pull back? I mean, you had this tremendous momentum going there. I mean, we could envision that you had 1,000 families, by 2020 or something.
Sure. And we may hit that. I guess since 2009, we've had over 700 families all in. But per year, 300 is about our carrying capacity. So it's actually good. We've begun to graduate some of those first families and said, hey, you've done this for 4 or 5 years now. We've taught you everything you need to know. You're pretty much on your own at this point. And so, we graduate them, and then that's how we can help new families.
I'm just curious if you're aware of other programs across the country that have reached this level of impact of, communities really beginning to develop their own food supply to this level. Yeah,
I think that in Olympia, Washington, there's an organization called Grub. I talked with them a little bit. There's another one out of Boston. Name is forgetting. I'm forgetting at the moment. I think what's really unique in what you're seeing in Westwood and with this model is we're not just giving a garden and then walking away. So it's not about just, I'll sell you a garden or I'll help you plant a garden and then good luck, you're on your own. We pay someone from their community to come to their house several times a month and check in on them so that they're providing that technical assistance, almost like an extension agent. But more importantly, they're building that relationship and they're pulling that family into this social fabric.
Yes.
Where now we're creating something that's bigger than just the garden, and it's bigger than even just the food system within the community. We're building relationships that we can then leverage for greater social change.
So along the way, when you had all these families, raising food in their yards, were you having community events, gatherings, all these people?
Yeah, we usually do a potluck early, right after all the gardens have been planted. It's kind of like okay, thank God that's over. We did it. So we'll do a potluck event just so families can also meet each other. And then later in the fall, we always do a harvest festival where we invite families to contribute food from their garden. And then we do just a huge harvest celebration as a community. And that's a really remarkable and tremendous thing to witness.
So there was this tremendous development of people, growing their own food in the community, and somewhere along the way, the idea was born to create a community-owned grocery store. Tell us how that came about. Yeah. What were the early discussions?
Well, I mean, the early genesis of it was we were trying to figure out what's the trajectory of this program, right?
Yeah.
Continuing to grow. We're starting to see some really incredible results year over year, but it's not, sorry, I'm turn this light for a second. There was just something about the ownership and handoff piece. We didn't want to continue to run a nonprofit program that is providing a service for people in perpetuity. So we really needed to think about ownership and ask ourselves, are we truly empowering this community to own this program? And ultimately, can it be financially self-sufficient so that it's not dependent upon philanthropists and foundations to continue to support? We were kind of, testing the wind, and while local food and food justice was really prominent 4 or 5 years ago, we knew that foundations move on, the winds change, and there's going to be another cause of the day later. And so
Yes.
we really had to think about how to financially sustain this community food system. And so we began looking at the cooperative model of ownership, which could, on one level, actually provide a physical and tangible mechanism to hand ownership over to the community. And then we were also looking at this bigger issue of, well, there's still not a grocery store in the neighborhood to meet the needs of all the people. We're seeing, hundreds of families grow their own food, which is great for 7-8 months out of the year. But what about the rest of the year? What about the rest of the community? So we knew a grocery store still needed to be part of the community food system. And we began having meetings with our families that were participating and asking them, just questions like, do you want a grocery store? What kind of grocery store? And over resounding yes. I mean, of course they need a grocery store in the neighborhood. And then we asked, well, what kind? Do you want a Sprouts? Do you want a King Soopers or Trader Joe's? Right? Oh yeah, I love a Trader Joe's. Well, then we started doing this exercise where we would say, where do you currently go buy your groceries? We kind of map it out and found that majority of families were traveling to Walmart to buy their groceries, King Soopers, maybe here and there. And he said, what happens to your money when you go shop at Walmart? Okay, and so we would sort of we would trace the paper trail, like where does your money go? Whose pocket does it end up? So here's a community that is struggling to make ends meet, and they're turning around and they're giving their hard-earned money to some corporation that has their headquarters in Bentonville, Arkansas, and is making billions of dollars a year of profit. Then we said, well, what would it take for this community to start a grocery store that's owned by the neighborhood so that when you go shop there, that money stays within the community? So we were doing a market study at this time, and what we found out is that within 3 minutes of where you could drive, there's about 6,000 households. And those 6,000 households every year spend about $19 million on groceries.
Wow.
But they're leaving, right? They're going elsewhere.
Yeah.
And then we said, there's only 3. And so out of that $19 million that's spent, I'm sorry, I got that a little wrong. Can we do that again?
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
So we're doing this market feasibility study that looked at within 3 minutes of where you could drive, there's about 6,000 households. And every year, those 6,000 households spend about $19.5 million a year on groceries.
Wow.
But due to the fact that there aren't any grocery stores in that same area, $16.5 million of that leaves the community and never comes back. So the $3 million that stays is usually it's at the corner store, the carniceria. It's not on healthy food generally. So we asked $16 million leaving every year. What would it take to capture that? So that's when we really started to see the community respond to this idea of starting a store that they could own, so they could keep that $16 million from leaving, and they could reinvest it back into the neighborhood.
Yeah. So that's really economic development at the grassroots level.
Yeah, it's economics as if people matter, right?
As if people matter, yeah. So where have you gotten to with the cooperative project now?
Sure. So 2014, we were able to incorporate the Westwood Food Cooperative. That same year, the city of Denver gave us a $1.3 million grant to purchase property. And when I say property, it was more or less a junkyard. So we spent about 2 years cleaning up a commercial property and getting it ready for development. And we're in the last stages of fundraising to open the store. And along the way, we've been sort of tweaking the scale and the size of the business model. Originally, we were thinking it was going to be a small store around 5,000 square feet. But when we dug into the numbers, we found out we actually could not make a store of that size profitable because it was too small. So there was this economy of scale that we really had to find a sweet spot where we could reach profitability so that, again, if there's a profit, it's owned by the community and it's distributed back. And so given that it's a lower income community, we're not going to be selling $10, $15 jars of pickles, Lower price points means we need to do a little bit more volume. And then we're now currently shooting for about a 12,000 square foot grocery store.
I see.
And we should have that open in 2019.
So what are the other components that are involved in this property there?
Yes, great question. So the property that we ended up purchasing was fairly large, and it gave us a lot of flexibility and really just a blank canvas to vision with the community and say what's really needed. So the grocery store, the Westwood Food Cooperative, is going to be one of the main anchors of the site. On site, we also will have an urban farm. We actually are growing right now. We've got about a little under an acre cultivated.
Oh.
In the process of getting permits to build a year-round greenhouse so we can do year-round production. And we're also developing a community center for events, for classes, for education, and some office space, along with a commercial kitchen and sort of commissary food hall. So a lot of different uses all coming together to meet the needs of the community. And the really exciting thing about it is that all of the businesses and all of the entities will be community owned and operated.
And so does this also function as something of a regional food hub as well?
It could. Yeah, it's a great question. We have tried to do somewhat of a market study to understand what the need for a food hub is, and specifically what types of processing and or storage opportunities there may be. We definitely see ourselves as a sort of a geographical food hub, probably for Southwest Denver at the minimum. And so we start looking at some of the other bordering neighborhoods and their needs in terms of food access. And we definitely feel that that's an area where we can play a strong role. In terms of a regional food hub, I'm not quite certain. There are maybe a couple more strategic neighborhoods in Denver that might be better suited for that. So we'll see.
And you're building, the foundations of infrastructure anyway, so it may sort of naturally fall to you.
It could for sure. I mean, you want to be positioned for it, but I think first and foremost, we need to meet the needs of the community, make sure we're doing that well, and then look out from there.
So people in the community have been growing their own food, or at least some of their own food, and now I imagine that with the development of the co-op, the grocery store, that people may expand their food production operations so that they will have food to be able to market at the store.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
We're getting asked all the time, when can I sell my extra produce? And we've seen some of those families year over year want to expand the size of their garden with that in mind, so that they can feed their family and then have another portion of the garden that's simply for.
So do people have the land available, the size of yards, to be able to support this kind of production?
Sure. I mean, one of the great assets of Westwood is it's predominantly single family homes. It's about 90% single family homes, and a lot of those are pretty large lots. So Westwood was unincorporated, and so it kind of developed along its own lines before it was annexed by Denver. So we do have large parcels, good soil, as I mentioned, and plenty of space. And then there are some pockets in the community that would be prime for maybe a little more centralized, high production urban farm.
That's very exciting.
It is, and I think a lot of what the big challenge in this whole movement is, like the local food movement, is how to make price points accessible to working class families while also paying farmers a dignified and fair wage. And those are kind of competing interests, right? And I think that what we're trying to build is a vertically integrated system where the same community that's growing the food, owns the food, and is purchasing the food. I think we can bring our own internal price points down on the production side to make it available to consumers at a low enough price point on the consumer side that it works. And then the great thing about Revision being a nonprofit and the Westwood Food Co-op being for-profit is the nonprofit can help do some of the back-end support to help lower the price point of food, whether it's covering staff, covering marketing, covering admin, and then let the for-profit just focus on trying to generate a little bit of return and reinvest that back into the community.
I want to ask you a little bit about the relationship between Revision and the cooperative, but first, I know that this is a multi-stakeholder cooperative, which is a very particular kind of animal. Could you describe what that means in your case? Yeah.
Sure. So a cooperative, at its most simple, is a business that's owned by a class of members. Generally, you find a consumer co-op, and so REI would be a good example of a consumer co-op. Then you've got producer co-ops, and so Organic Valley is a good example of a producer co-op where many farmers, many producers pool their product together and sell it under one label. And then a little less common, but starting to, I think, increase our worker-owned co-ops. And so whether that's a manufacturing company or a coffee shop that is owned by its employees, I mean, there's a lot of different forms. We're trying to bring all three of those different stakeholders in together in one ownership model. And so as a consumer, you can own a portion of the business. As a producer, you own a portion of the business. And then as a worker, you own the other third of it.
So are people actually buying in to the co-op?
Right now, we've only been selling the consumer memberships.
Okay.
We've got about 275 owner members that have paid their membership dues. And we'd like to be at about 1,200 by the time the co-op opens. At that point, the workers of the co-op will be able to purchase their membership. And then the producers, once we also are getting closer to open, will be able to invest and own a share of it as well.
So tell us a little bit about the structure here and the relationship between Revision and the cooperative.
Sure. I mean, it's pretty basic. Revision helped incorporate the co-op, and in doing so, we wanted to have some classification of stock or shares that would give us voting rights as an organization. And so currently, Revision has 2 appointed seats on the board of directors at any time, and that just
out of how many?
Up to 15, I think.
Okay.
Board members. We do a lot of grant writing on behalf of the co-op to do technical assistance and capacity building. And again, so that helps the co-op focus on its core function, getting its business plan together, doing membership, and then allows us to take on some of the administrative burden so that they don't have to focus on that. And then the big thing right now is Revision is doing the property development. So we're raising all the capital, and we'll basically be handing the co-op the keys to a brand new store, and they will pay below market rate rents on that once they move into it.
So is the property owned by Revision then?
It is at the moment.
Okay.
We've been talking about in the future of putting into a community land trust that's owned by people of the neighborhood that can buy shares into the land trust.
Wow. Well, it's a very interesting structure. We've talked a little bit about cooperatives in the past, and I know that you had an opportunity to go to Mondragon to learn a little bit more about what they're doing, and I'm curious about what impact that encounter with the Mondragon perspective has had on what you're doing with Revision and the Westwood Cooperative.
When you said it's an interesting model, I think what you probably were saying between the lines is it sounds very complicated and a lot of hard work, which it is.
It is in a process sense, certainly, right?
It's a lot of hard work. And I think that's what Mondragon really drove home for me. It's easy to look at the size and the scale that they're at today.
Yeah.
What you don't recognize is it's 70 years of history. And you think about all of the meetings that they've had in that 70 years.
Yes, right.
Right. That's a lot of meetings about process and stuff like that. So, no, I think that Mondragon, the biggest thing that I took away from it is it seems to be that their success in my mind, is kind of contingent upon having somewhat of a homogenous group of people or a shared group identity, which for the Basque people in northern Spain, they started these co-ops out of necessity because they were being persecuted by the Franco government.
Yes.
They lost the Civil War. They had to do this in order to survive.
They were highly motivated.
Highly motivated, right? And so same with like a community like Westwood.
Yeah.
Pretty homogenous. They're highly motivated. They're going to do what they need to do to survive. It's just about planting the seeds of communal solutions together versus everybody trying to go at it alone, right? And so that's the other thing that Mondragon, I think I really took away from it, is how much emphasis they have on what I would call like co-op education and instilling the values of cooperation. It's not just in the businesses, it's in how they run day-to-day life. Everything seems to come from this place of putting the group above the individual and, you know, making the sacrifice for the greater good. And I think that's if we want to see successful co-ops in this country, we've got a lot of work to do to change the narrative and to really reframe the value set within our communities that get us to work together more.
Well, it seems very encouraging that this surge of interest in cooperatives, and we see cooperatives popping up all over the place here in the Rocky Mountain region. And it also seems that that's a strong force that's counter to this society of individualism and competition and dominance over each other. But it's taken a long time to get to this point where it could take off.
You got it. Yeah. If you look at the density of cooperatives in this country, you know, you see them in the Northwest, Northeast, a little bit in the Great Lakes region, and in Colorado. I mean, there's really very, very few.
Very few, yeah.
If you look at the sort of rugged pioneer mentality we claim, you know, that we have, or that we claim to be, I think you're right. It is difficult to instill that, and there's some hope. It's really exciting to see the co-op movement grow within the Front Range, as you mentioned.
Yeah, it really is. It's very encouraging. It's one of the things that we're talking about in the summit, you know, with Poudre Valley Community Farms up in Fort Collins, and the emerging project outside of Boulder, 63rd Street Farm, a CSA that is considering becoming a cooperative. We see these as very encouraging developments.
Yeah, and I think the more you come back to it, I mean, one of the principles of co-ops is cooperation amongst cooperatives, and
yes,
right. I need these other co-ops to be successful so that I can become more successful, because it paves a way for consciousness, and it also creates a network where we are able to, I think, work together more. So just in Denver, I mean, there are several co-ops that are, you know, on their process of trying to open, and we see that as a great thing. By no means competition. I mean, if one of them succeeds, I think it's going to help us succeed as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So you're almost 10 years into this project, right?
Yeah.
And you've accomplished a tremendous amount. You know, you have catalyzed a community developing its own local food system.
Right.
You know, you've got families growing a significant portion of their own food, and now you're building a community-owned food center. I mean, it's more than just a grocery store. You know, much more. It's part of a local food economy that's developing there. So you've accomplished a lot in 10 years here, or let's say that you have been allowed to accomplish a lot in 10 years. What's next? What do you see is potentially the next phase for this community and for your own involvement in all this?
Yeah, really good question. At first when we started in Westwood, we thought that, okay, 7 years and then we'll be on and we'll be doing the next thing somewhere else. Quickly realized like there's no, like, I mean, this is decades long work.
There's no exit.
There's definitely an exit. It's probably, I mean, now we're shooting honestly for like the 15-year mark. And we've begun to look at our sort of life cycle in 3 distinct phases, where that first phase is really trying to build a community food system. And for us, food was always the vehicle towards the greater vision of a community that comes together where you have broad ownership of its businesses that generates its own wealth and is truly resilient, where it's not so dependent upon the broader outside, nationalized, globalized economy, whatever you want to look at, right? And so that first phase is about building the food system, knowing that agriculture is the foundation of community.
Yes.
We need to redevelop a food system to then let us build upon it.
Yes.
The second phase for us is really then organizing a community and finding the ways that we can unite around a common vision, as well as beginning to invest substantial time, money, and effort into the leaders and the champions of the neighborhood. So where people may have started off as wanting a garden, and we hired folks from the neighborhood to work as paid gardeners and educators, that's just scratching the surface. We've then been able to identify where the talent and the passion lies within people and within the community. And now we need to invest in it to bring that out to flourish. And then that helps us get to our third phase, which is now trying to think about all of the different systems within that economy and how can we re-own them in a way that generates community wealth that stays within the neighborhood and hopefully builds generations of future wealth. And so that's really that third phase that we're entering right now with this property development, as you mentioned, sort of being a multi-use, having so many of these different facets. We're looking at a community land trust as a mechanism to begin owning both the residential, but even potentially open space and commercial property owned by the people that live there, giving them the power to make the decisions so that outside developers and other people can't force the community because they've got more economic power, right? And I think that once we secure the food system and once we secure our real estate or our land and housing, then we can turn to looking at very similar to Mondragon, what are the other types of enterprises that we can start from within our assets that are going to further expand opportunity, further meet the needs of this community, and really help it improve and develop from within, but again, always led and owned by the people.
And in terms of your own role, how do you see your own role in this evolving over time in the future?
Great question. I asked myself that. And yeah, I mean, I think that coming back from Mondragon, I realized again just how important the education was, the awareness building, the culture creation, and so I'm very proud to say that a lot of our staff, I mean, the majority of the staff that we have at Revision now have come from the community. So people that started off as a garden participant that those first couple of years was teaching them, and then I gave them a job, and then, they expressed a desire, and we saw the talent and the underutilized talent, honestly, for people to say, like, you need to be a manager. We need to put you on this track where you are going to take over my job one day. And that's really the vision, is that we want all of the organization to come from that community, and at that point, I don't know, maybe I can sit back and relax, or
I doubt it.
Yeah, I know, right? No, just continuing that culture and the educational aspect of it.
It seems like somewhere along the way, maybe not too far down the road from now, there must be a book in the works.
Maybe I'll recruit you as a ghostwriter. You're much more eloquent with words than I am.
Oh, but you're the one who's been learning right there on the front lines.
Yeah. Well, hey, I do think there's an opportunity to share our story in a way
Yeah.
that, not that I think our thinking has shifted from wanting to go directly and transplant this and more extending an invitation for communities to come to us and learn directly from us. And then forming some sort of relationship where, we can continually provide resources, technical support, advice, but letting those communities really shape and develop how they see best.
So you have moved to this community yourself, and it sounds like you're planning on raising your family there as well. Is that right?
It is. My wife and I are expecting a little girl in December, and I'm currently in the middle of a crazy home remodel. But yeah, this is where we want to be. And I felt, I moved here, I think in the third year, the revision was working in the neighborhood. Mm-hmm. I just felt, it's so important that I invest in this neighborhood and experience day-to-day life in a way that if I'm going home, at the end of the day to some other community, I really don't know what it's like truly to live here, and therefore I shouldn't be making decisions on behalf of this neighborhood.
So has Westwood really become home for you?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'd say I spend 80% of my time in this community. I mean, I rarely go to other parts of Denver now. It feels a little odd when I do, but yeah, it's a beautiful, honestly, one of the most beautiful neighborhoods. The people here are so hardworking, so humble, so kind, and just intentional in a way that, I think has created a community that I could not find anywhere else, honestly. Yeah. And I think that we're all searching for that connection, right? Feeling like we belong to something meaningful and something that gives purpose and is bigger than ourselves. So.
Well, that kind of leads into the last question that I wanted to ask. I mean, we could talk all day long. There's so much to say about what you're doing there, and
we need to come out for a visit soon.
Yeah, I'd love to. But I'm wondering what, most of the people who are tuning in to the local food summit are people who are already involved in local food work in some way. They're looking at this challenge of localizing their food supply, building local food systems. And I'm wondering what kind of advice or counsel or challenge that you might offer to this particular audience.
That's a great question. I think over the past probably 4 or 5 years of my involvement in this work, it really became more apparent to me how important it is for us, for those of us in this work, in relocalizing our food system, of challenging the status quo, of trying to create an alternative, that we truly understand the root cause of structural racism and oppression that have manifested throughout our economy. And if we're just rebuilding something new and not aware of that historical starting point, I fear that we're just going to continue to build a new version that will build a new version of a food system that still maintains that structural racism and oppression of working class and of communities of color.
Yeah.
And so I think the challenge to all of us is, let's build something new and better, but let's also make sure that we really understand power and privilege in a way that makes us uncomfortable. And it does, and it's something we've got to, particularly as white folk involved in this work, we've got to challenge each other to have those conversations. And when we don't, I think we create, on one hand, we make the movement so elitist that it creates a lot of backlash, and it creates a vacuum for what I do believe we saw in this most recent election, where a strong, nationalistic figure can capitalize on it. When honestly, a lot of rural America, those are our allies in rebuilding a food system. And
yes.
we need to be right, breaking bread together more and having those
Right,
conversations and finding common ground, as opposed to building a local food system that pushes people further and further away.
yeah. Really, really important. And part of what I hear and what you're saying is that we need to learn how to thoroughly decolonize ourselves.
Mhm. See, again, you're so much more eloquent than I am.
Come on.
But yes.
No, the colonization process that's taken place in, especially in this country over the last 75 years or so, is so profound, so deep, that it's gone largely unconscious. So we take it for granted, even to the point that we're willing to call ourselves willingly consumers all the time, which to me, I mean, that's the most economically derisive term that we could use for each other, let alone ourselves.
Yeah, and I think and to part of that, we need to be better about honoring those that have come before us. And
Yes.
I think that within local food, there can be such an emphasis on new and hip and cool, and and not honoring, the fact that agriculture is predominantly done by people of color, and looking at, like agriculture in the South, and how much of what we, as maybe foodies, as people in the local food movement, are maybe appropriating where that culture, that food came from originally, was at a position, again, of poverty, of slavery, of necessity. And we need to not take something and appropriate it and make it cool and hip and trendy. Growing food is difficult work, and is usually done by people that are not are exploited and that are not dignified. And so we need to make sure that we give dignity back to those people.
Yes, very well said. Well, Eric, thank you so much for participating in the Local Food Summit, and we look forward to getting updates in the future.
Absolutely. Love to host you at some point, and look forward to all the other amazing, inspiring speakers that you'll have as part of the summit.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.